Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. I know it's Science Fiction Saturday, but it's also Halloween. So I'm doing horror for this video and the next one. And I found some modern horror movies which have an incredible feel of old horror movies. The first one's from 2022 and the sequel is from 2023. But they feel like old films. And what I'm going to recommend to you, based on advice from Stephanie over at the Movie Chatter YouTube channel, is that you watch the prequel before you watch the original movie. And I know that goes against all common wisdom. Trust me on this one. You're going to want to watch the prequel before you watch the original film. They're both by Ty West. They're both 1970s style slashers, each in their own way. They're not overly gory, but they are good, solid, character-based horror films. The first is X, starring Mia Goth, Martin Henderson, and Brittany Snow. And this is something really weird and special. And the prequel, which is the one you should watch first, is Pearl, also starring Mia Goth. And this one is a head spin. Both of them were made in New Zealand, even though they're set in Texas. They were made in New Zealand during the COVID lockdowns because New Zealand was the safest place in the world at the time before we had the vaccines. And so they made them back to back. They made X first, and then Ty West, the director and writer, said to Mia Goth, I've got this idea for a second film. Do you want to stick around New Zealand? And we'll make this second film. And she collaborated with him on the script, and between them they made Pearl. But we're going to talk about Pearl first because that's the one you need to watch to understand the main character. Pearl's set in 1918 in Texas during the influenza pandemic. The soldiers are returning from World War I, and Pearl's husband, Howard, is still away for most of the movie. He turns up at the end, but she is living on the rural farm owned by her parents, who are first-generation German immigrants. So they're kind of alienated from the community anyway, because, of course, World War I was fought against the Germans. Her father is infirmed. He's probably had a stroke, and he's in a wheelchair, slumping, and he has facial paralysis on one side. And her mother is really nasty to Pearl. She's dealing with the fact that her husband is infirmed. She's dealing with a daughter she knows isn't right in the head. And Pearl is under her mother's thumb to a certain extent. She's handling most of the chores on the farm. She loves cinema. She wants to be a chorus girl and get away from the farm, get away from her parents, and live a life on her own terms. She doesn't quite know whether Howard's alive or dead. There hasn't been enough communication for her to know that one way or the other. And so she's living this life of desperation. She is, in the classic sense, a sympathetic monster. We see her on the farm with the big red barn, and she's talking to the cows in the barn. She's talking to the sheep in the barn. What the family doesn't know, apart from Pearl, is there's also an enormous alligator in their lake, and she feeds the alligator in interesting ways. So Pearl has to ride her bicycle into town to get supplies for the family at times, and she goes to the cinema in town and watches a musical, and it was done the way that it was in silent era, where there were big records that were put on synchronized with the visuals because there wasn't sound movies yet. Now the movie's projectionist is played by an actor called David Corenswet, who is going to be the new Superman in the James Gunn iterations of the DCEU, and he kind of takes a liking to Pearl. He's a bit of a bohemian. He's a little bit of a rake. He takes her into the projection booth after these sessions and shows her one of the first adult films ever made in America, a thing called A Free Ride. So Pearl's kind of aroused most of the time, and she has feelings for this projectionist, but that she doesn't act on them immediately. And riding on the way home, she sees a scarecrow in the cornfield, and that leads to a really interesting scene as well, but it's a very, very scary scarecrow. So Pearl goes home and she's confronted by her mother. Her sister-in-law, Howard's sister, comes around, gives the family a suckling pig to help them out with the fact that they can't afford to buy things much. So she's going around in her car dispensing charity to all of the people in the community who are doing it a bit tough. She's quite a sweet girl. She and Pearl have an interesting, odd relationship. And then Pearl goes totally mad and driven to extremes by her mother. And even before that, Pearl is kind of really, really off the rails. She has a confrontation with her mother, which ends up very badly, and she goes on a rampage and does some really, really odd and transgressive things. I'm trying not to do too much of a spoiler here, but she basically goes nuts. Inevitably, Howard comes home, and there's a little scene at the end which is confronting and weird and funny at the same time. I'm not going to do too much spoilers on here. You've got to go for the ride. But there is a magnificent tracking shot toward the end of this movie of Pearl running after somebody, which is done incredibly well. It doesn't necessarily draw attention to itself, and it plays out naturalistically. Ty West does a magnificent job of it, and Mia Goth playing Pearl is something truly extraordinary. There's some surreal scenes where she hallucinates as she gets a chance to become a chorus girl, because there are some people traveling through town who are looking for a chorus girl, and we see Pearl's imagination rather than what actually happens up on the stage when she auditions for this particular role. It's crazy, but it's entertainingly crazy, and that beautiful saturated color matched with the weird horror that we see in this film makes it something truly extraordinary. So that's the one to watch first, definitely, and I recommend that you do watch it. If you're an old school horror fan, you're not going to get torture porn in this one. You're going to get kind of realistic but grounded and not too icky horror, and it works really well. So Pearl is one of the surprising films for me this year, and that cover art pretty much says it all. But yeah, that one, high recommend from me. It is a mad film. It's an interesting film, and it's a horror film that is unlike other horror films you've ever seen. Then we go back to the original film, the first one, called X, which is set in 1979, where a van full of people are traveling to a country location, which turns out to be Pearl's farm. There's a lodge near the lake on the farm, which is hired out to this crew who are going to make adult films in the lodge. The director, played by Martin Henderson, a New Zealand actor, wants to outdo Debbie Does Dallas. He's got a film crew, he's got a cameraman, he's got a boom mic operator, played by Jenna Ortega, who was in Wednesday. He's got his female film star, played by Brittany Snow, who's really interesting. Her character is grounded and smarter than anybody else in the group. She's really a world-wise, at times almost maternal person in the group. You got the mandatory stud, played by Scott McCuddy, who is quite well equipped for being a porn star, let's just say that. And you do see an outline, the reason why he's well equipped to be a porn star later in the film. And then you've got Mia Goth playing Maxine, who is the girlfriend of the director, but is also one of the actors in the adult film. It's 1979. Pearl's old, Howard's old. Now it shows the crew to the lodge. We only see Pearl in the upper window of the house, watching them from a distance. So the crew start making their adult film, and Maxine wants to be a big star. She's a bit of a cokehead. She wants to make it big in Hollywood, even though she's starting out in an adult film. And she is the final girl in this particular slasher film. So Howard gets grumpy with the crew because he didn't know they were going to be making an adult film, and they continue to make the film. But Pearl comes out of the house and starts watching them through the window and starts lusting after them, even though she is in her late 80s. She's old, but she is horny, and she's incredibly scary. Because we've already seen the prequel, we know what young Pearl is capable of. And so seeing old Pearl, we wonder how she's going to handle this. She's old, but she wants to sleep with all of these people. So it is in that psycho bitty genre of crazy old lady horror films, but with a sexualized aspect to it that makes it even creepier. It's a really interesting and weird film. And inevitably, as Pearl goes on a rampage and starts killing people and feeding them to her alligator, which we saw as a younger alligator in the prequel. And if alligators are anything like Australian crocodiles can live to be 100 years old. So it's not implausible that that alligator is still in the lake in 1979. The movie's got a 1970s slightly washed out colour palette, which is really good. And the characters all have groundedness, which is interesting. We've got the ambitious director. We've got Maxine, who wants to be a star. We've got Bobby Lynn Parker, played by Brittany Snow, who knows what kind of movie she's in and is probably a better filmmaker than the director. Scott McCready's character, whose name is Jackson Hole. And we've also got the camera guy, who is the boyfriend of the boom mic operator, played by Jenna Ortega. Her name's Lorraine. And so you've got all of this dynamic going. In the meantime, people start dying off in the night, and nobody suspects that it's the old lady living in the house. Now, this movie's got a lot of influences from earlier decades, and I've just written down a couple of them. Texas Chainsaw Massacre being the obvious one. Psycho, with the crazy old lady in the house. Hardcore, the movie with George C. Scott looking for his daughter. And that gives us a bit of a backstory on Maxine and where she comes from. And Maxine's backstory is in the movie right from the very first scene, which is a flash forward to the cops finding all the bodies on the property. And Maxine's backstory is in that scene, but we don't know it at the time. There's The Shining, there's Alligator, the movie that John Sayles wrote for Larry Cohen. That's got a little bit of an influence there. Boogie Nights and Debbie Does Dallas, of course, that's name-checked in the movie. It's a really fine bit of slasher film. It's slightly comedic, but also incredibly scary. And because we've seen young Pearl, seeing old Pearl in the movie that was made first makes us sympathetic to her, even though we're horrified by her. She is a unique horror movie monster. And like many monsters in horror movies that are really top draw, she's a sympathetic monster. And in fact, all the monsters in the movie are. Howard's allowed Pearl to be what she is and tried to keep her under control for 60 years. And that's driven him mad and made him something of a monster. And Pearl's mother in Pearl is a sympathetic monster. She's tried to deal with her daughter who is not right in the head and a husband who is suddenly infirm. She's just can't handle it because there aren't the resources to assist her in handling them. So the movies are made with an old-fashioned sensibility and a knowledge of classic horror films, at least as far back as the 1970s. And yet, they're made for a modern audience and they work incredibly well. The weirdest thing about it is Pearl at the heart of it, because Pearl is a female version of toxic masculinity. Everything she does with regard to other people is something that a toxic male would do with the genders flipped. She's urgent and insistent in her sexuality. She's pushy in it. She's predatory. And that makes it a really good reflection of one of our social problems with the genders reversed. Pearl's insanity is based on frustration and sexuality and sadism all mixed together. It's mind-blowingly good. There is going to be a third film as well, where Maxine, who's the final girl who does survive all of the stuff that happens in X. Bit of a spoiler there, but it doesn't really matter. You still got to enjoy the film. It's already in pre-production. It's set in 1985, where Maxine goes on to try to make a career in Hollywood, about 6 years after the events of X. Look forward to that. I think it'll make a nice cohesive trilogy. And very much the creators in these films know what they're doing and know where they're going with them. And Mia Goth is probably my favourite modern horror movie star. She has fine acting skills. She's willing to go to weird places to make a character believable. And the other thing I didn't mention, which I should have mentioned earlier, is old Pearl is played by Mia Goth at the same time she's playing Maxine. There's very fine old age makeup for Mia Goth in this film. And there's even some really good photography where old Pearl gets in bed with Maxine. It's the most off-the-wall, unexpected, and satisfying pair of horror movies I've seen in a very long time. These films you need to check out, even if you're not into modern horror films. The sensibility of old-school films and the beautiful pastel palette you get with Pearl, and then the 1970s slightly washed-out film stock look of X are going to land it for you. You really need to check these films out. They're both wonderfully well done. They're both amusing at times and horrifying at other times. and they're a high recommendation from me. And thank you again to Stephanie over at Movie Chatter for recommending these films. They are exactly the kinds of films I like watching when I'm in the mood for this kind of film. You got to check these two films out, and definitely watch Pearl first. It's going to be a much more rewarding experience, and it's going to intensify what you see in X, having seen the backstory of the character of Pearl. So thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, hit the notification bell, leave me an emoji if you can't think of a comment. You can also support the channel by becoming a channel member, and there's a link in the description on how to do that. I'll also link to Stephanie's page, Movie Chatter, where she talks about a lot of films, particularly horror films, that she enjoys. And you can also support my channel by becoming a patron at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. I'm going to be doing another horror movie video next time around, where I take a double feature that actually appeared in cinemas in the 1970s, and I'm going to watch those two movies and review them. And I'm looking forward to doing that. So until then, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies. Take a chance on some modern horror movies. If you choose them wisely like these two, you're going to have a really fun experience. So check these two out, and I'll catch you next time.